Very good. Well, we'll be moving on to our next topic now, which is going to be a fascinating panel discussion. I have no doubt that it's one of the areas on the agenda, not that everything on the agenda isn't of great interest to you today, of course, but one that's of particular interest. And we're welcoming some esteemed guests into this panel to talk about feedback from on-site inspections for internal audit teams, lessons learned, and the ongoing effectiveness of internal audit, which absolutely, of course, is a topic very close to all of our hearts. So I'd like to welcome our guests, our panelists to the discussion. So we have Pietro Giammario from the ECB and Margit Lang. Thank you very much both for joining. Really appreciate your time, and I know that you've given your time previously to this event, so it is very great to see you back. So Pietro, as a brief introduction, is the head of non-financial risk inspection division in the ECB. I think formerly a lot of experience in the Banco d'Italia, supervising G-SIFIs before moving into the ECB. And Margit, for yourself, head of section responsible for inspections on areas such as governance, risk management and capital, and a long career in German commercial banking and the Deutsche Bundesbank prior to that. So a huge amount of insight in the panel, and really looking forward to the discussion with yourselves. How we're going to run this, we'll go. I know there's a sentiments you would like to share, Pietro and Margit, in terms of lessons learned from on-site inspections in a short while. Prior to that, we will just catch a quick initial view from yourselves, and then we'll be peppering the session with some delegate voting options using Slido, some open questions so that we can see what's on people's minds and we can reflect on that in the panel. And then if we get time, there will be a pause at the end for lots of the questions from the delegates, which I'm sure will come flooding in. So before we get to maybe your short presentation of lessons we should all be taking away as heads of internal audit, I'd like to maybe start by getting a quick word from each of you, Pietro and Margit, about the main challenges for internal audit teams now, with a breadth of new topics coming on, including things such as sustainability that we've heard about already a few times today. But how would you see the main challenges for internal auditors in Europe at the moment? Maybe come to yourself, Pietro, first.
Many thanks, Steve. I hope that you can hear me.
Can indeed, very clearly.
Okay, thank you. Very good, very good. No, first of all, many thanks for inviting. I'm also open to receive the questions that maybe the colleagues would like to raise at the end of this, or maybe also after that. I'm also open to talk to them. I would like to stress that from our point of view, the main value added that the internal audit could provide is always the same. So to support the board in order to set up a very effective internal control framework, and also help the board to in their activity of constructively challenge the senior management proposal. These are the two main objectives. Of course, the way you apply this objective or achieve these objectives change according to the new risk, the emerging risk. And I would like to mention two risks that are nowadays we are discussing a lot, that are the digital transformation and the climate change. And I would like not to forget that the colleagues from the internal audit are very important to preserve the risk culture. This culture is I would like to say that the real line of defense that prevents the reputational risk. So it's important that in their job they are doing this. Regarding climate and digitalization, of course, these are the two things that will affect the way will affect maybe heavily also the business model of the bank in the future. Maybe it's not something that will appear immediately, but in perspective they are very, very important. especially for the climate. We need to be prepared for the transition. For the digitalization, I would like to say one thing. For us, it's not only IT. It's also the impact of the digitalization on the business model. So the role of the internal audit should be both IT and how the bank is prepared for the business model.
Very good point, Pietro. Thank you. And Margaret, just to come to yourself and get your perspectives on this broader question of key challenges for European internal auditors at the moment. What would be your thoughts?
Thank you. And first of all, also, I'm happy to be here, and good morning to everyone. So I would like to add that the internal audit function has to be agile in a changing environment. What does this mean concretely? The internal audit function has, if necessary, to change the multi-year audit plan and make it risk-oriented. The internal audit function has to think about what are the needs of their staff members. They might need new qualifications. They have to understand and assess these new risks. New risks usually come with new risk models. So audit staff has to be familiar with these new risk models, needs trainings, for example. And also, internal audit has to think about changing its methodology and adapting it to new challenges. Just a quick summary. And if you want, we have also a slide prepared. Maybe that's the time where you want to upload this slide.
Yeah, I think we can move on to that. Just to pause on your point there, from my own perspectives, Margaret, I completely agree with you. I think when I was reflecting on this first question, my mind went to the breadth of topics and risks. Internal audit has always had to stay across, but they continue to grow as new risks such as digitization and environment, as Pietro mentioned, get added to the more traditional, if you like. So the risk prioritization for auditors becomes yet more challenging, I think. And then inherently linked to that, I would agree, I think it's evolving audit approaches. I don't think as internal audit teams we can expect we can continue with the same practices and approaches that we've always done in the past. We need to be more agile. We need to be coming up with new ways to provide assurance on good outcomes against these risks, and that requires change and transformation, and that's a big challenge. So I'd agree with all the points made. So yeah, maybe if I might hand to yourselves to bring up the slides, and we'd be delighted to hear some of your thoughts in terms of lessons learned for internal audit teams.
Okay, thank you. So what I have now here is not a statistic that we presented in the years before, because we don't or have not done, due to COVID-19, so many on-site inspections as we have done in the past years. So I don't want to come up with random results here and maybe wrong statistics that lead to wrong conclusions. So what I have done is I simply had a look on the internal audit findings of this year's, even internal audit findings in the pipeline and the previous year, and had also a look on the root causes. And this is something that you might not always see in statistics. I have already mentioned that internal audit stuff is really important. And what I have detected when assessing internal audit findings of this year, of the last year, I could clearly see a certain pattern that internal audit stuff really matters, not only from a quantitative, but also from a qualitative perspective. Because what I have seen in these findings are 4 points that are closely linked with a lack of internal audit stuff. We had a lot of findings on risk calculations that have not been challenged by internal audit, especially the assumptions have not been challenged. Obviously, the internal audit staff did not always have the expertise or the time to challenge these assumptions. Closely connected was another observation, material miscalculations. So I'm now speaking about material miscalculations, not about small mistakes that don't change the overall picture. Material risk calculation of risk figures were not detected for quite a while, also not by internal audit. Despite when we came and assessed the data, we saw sometimes easily that there must be something wrong with these figures. Another point that's also relevant is the inadequate coverage by internal audit of certain processes, entities, or also certain risks. Here we always have to keep in mind that it's also relevant for the risk appetite framework and the limit system to see that everything, all risks, all units are covered in the banks that are significant. Last but not least, a lack of resources also leads to a lack of responsiveness and agility to changes. So we saw that severe incidents happened, for example, fraud, cyber incidents, and at least for us, internal audit continued with business as usual. Also due to a lack of resources. We can think about all internal, external developments. I have mentioned also COVID-19, and I have mentioned it on purpose with a question mark, because here I have not seen a concentration of findings. Maybe they are still to come, but that's why here I could not observe things.
That's really interesting insights there, and I think does serve to further highlight some of the points already made in the opening comments there, particularly around the agility aspect and the ability and capability and capacity for audit functions to see what's actually happening in businesses and respond appropriately to your last point. And I think the point around risk calculations not being challenged, I think with agility, one of the things that I'm drawing from your conclusions is, whilst we need to be agile, we still need to be able to go deep and really get under the bonnet and challenge the substance of a lot of this stuff. So agility doesn't just mean lots of topics and a shallow skim across the top. We still need to be able to do that. Maybe with that as a topic to think about, that makes me think about a number of opportunities and threats for audit teams going forward. I'd be keen to get your thoughts. So Margit, maybe starting with yourself, based on what you've seen there, what's your reflections on the opportunities we have as a profession? All of us here attending today should take away and seek to leverage, and some of the threats for us to watch out for.
Okay. Yes, go ahead, Margit.
So maybe I would like to first think about threats, because this is exactly what I've been presenting before. Stuff matters, and you can train stuff and you can change your training program, but at one point you will need new staff members. And this is really also crucial, and we see when we perform on-site inspections, or now at the moment off-site inspections, that positions in internal audit are vacant for quite a while. And it seems difficult for the banks to hire new and well-equipped staff and attract them. So internal audits needs sometimes new and qualified staff members, and that's not that easy. So the solution could be outsourcing, in-house outsourcing, external outsourcing providers. But when the bank has difficulties to hire and attract new staff members in internal audit, it might be also difficult for external service providers. Yeah. So this here is clearly a threat. So banks have to tackle both, developing the existing staff, but also on the other side, ensure that they can also hire new staff members with the relevant skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And Pietro, moving to yourself.
Yes, yes, I can comment on the opportunities, so the good side. In a word, I would like to summarize this. To take the lessons also from the pandemic, it's relevant for the agility, especially for the agility, and also to be open to the innovation. There are emerging risks we don't have maybe all the answers to the questions, how to deal the different things. We are in a learning phase, also we as a supervisor. But I would like to say that all this effort should be focused on the increasing of the quality of the results. That is high, but maybe could be higher. I mentioned also, for example, for the opportunities, there is also the IT could also help us with the artificial intelligence also applied to the internal audit technique in order to maybe make everyone more efficient and also to detect some other problems that maybe require a lot of time for the audit team. Of course, we are also experiencing internally and try to apply this kind also of techniques. So this is something we can share with you. It's not easy because you have also to teach the machine how to work. But I would like to stress one principle: no machine can exchange and the important role of human person. So we see the artificial intelligence and other tools, machine learning, as a help to increase the capability to analyze the data and also to strengthen the quality of result with the root causes, but the human is essential.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, some really great points there that I'd absolutely recognize from my own day-to-day operation as well. Certainly the increasing use of data, AI, new techniques to drive value to our organizations in terms of the right assurance outcomes. I think in that opportunity space, there is a huge amount that internal audit teams can do to help organizations and their customers and have real impact if we leverage some of these new emerging approaches, Pietro. So I absolutely agree with that. The staffing threat is very familiar. It'd be interesting maybe when we get to questions to hear any reflections and from the delegates on this. I would certainly have seen post-pandemic, or not post-pandemic yet, but second year of pandemic, attrition generally I'm noticing across sectors is up, and I've certainly noticed that in my own team. So hiring is challenging, finding the right skills to the point is difficult in a hotly competitive market, and then retaining the staff is a challenge. And I do think there's been some form of post-pandemic latency and people wanting to just change their lives and careers that we're now seeing coming through. So it's definitely in my crosshairs for the rest of this year. Okay, let's mix up the approach a bit for a while, and I think we've got a question we'd like to put to the audience. We're going to ask you to rate from high to low the risks that you see as most significantly increasing in your bank today. So if you'd like to use the Slido information reminder there on the left to just provide your votes for this, 1 to 5, so 5 being high and 1 being low, and let's see what comes through. What risks are on people's minds? Just while we wait for the slide to update there, it's I think this just the capture on this slide just serves to remind the breadth and the combination of the traditional classic risks, if you like the market, credit, liquidity, fraud, etc., and then the new ones such as the climate. Right, so I think this will need a little bit of time to bed down. So let's just take a pause and see how this evolves. I do find this quite exciting, watching the bars move up and down. I've got in my own mind where I think this might go, so let's see how close I would be. I wonder how much the previous presentation contributes to fin crime as well. It was a very compelling fin crime presentation we had. So IT risk is certainly performing strongly. No surprise there. Digitization, Pietro and Margit, like we talked about at the start. Business model risk and climate coming right up now, look as well. This is really interesting. There's certainly some hot topics on the more emergent side which are starting to come towards the top, such as the climate, digitization, and the traditional risks more towards the bottom. So your capital, liquidity, etc. Okay, this is interesting. So just looking at that, it looks familiar to some of the points we've already made, but maybe speaking to, let's tackle the climate one. As we've spoken a bit about digitization, but the climate risk is clearly on auditors' minds. We touched on it with Evelyn as well earlier on in terms of the approaches. Pietro, I might just come to you for this one as you reflect on that slide there and you see climate is worrying.
Yes, yes.
I know it's an area that you're looking at as well. So what reflections did you have on climate risk and internal audit's role there?
Yes, no, many thanks, Steve. I would like to stress at the beginning of this part that climate risk is something new for everyone, also for the supervisor. So we are in a phase of a collective knowledge of how this we have to deal with this risk. Also because this risk is a little bit different from the other one that we have familiar, so credit risk, market risk, because it's a transversal risk, and all transversal risk is difficult to manage. I think that clearly we are approaching a climate risk at the beginning. You know that the stress test at the ECB, but we are also looking at to start some inspections. The last part of next year, maybe focusing on how the banks are aware about and the board are aware of the problem and try to establish plan. We would be very happy if every bank start to discuss internally these things and prepare a transitional plan. Of course, we are not waiting, we are not expecting that all banks have already done whatever, also because the implication is not so easy. For example, exit from one sector or maybe increasing provision whatsoever is not something that you can do from one day to another. Other two aspects that for our are important. So just to summarize, for us, the climate risk in this first phase is more linked to how it affects the business in the future. So awareness, transition plan. Second point is the data quality. You know that if you see also the intervention from Andrea Ria and the other member of the supervisory board, there is a huge request also for the bank to collect the data from their own in order to assess properly the climate risk. Maybe this requires time, but we would see some actions that start more or less immediately, would like to say, because there is urgency on that topic. Of course, there is also these greenwashing activities that we have also to deal with at certain point, because it affects also the way we correctly address, because there is also a way to correctly address the climate risk. In perspective, there could be also a huge impact on the credit risk, because imagine when we are discussing about collateral in the commercial real estate, residential real estate, imagine that they will require a certification of energy. Maybe they do not have it. So how to value the LGD, for example, for that loan? What would be the impact? So this could be, but a very, very, very important topic to be dealt maybe in the future. So what we expect from the internal audit, of course, is not doing everything, because it's the business and the first and second line of defense that they should do this. But of course, this idea of supporting the board to make the right decision, so collect what are the gaps internal of the organization and highlight to the board. This is the role that we see from the internal audit in this field. That's it. You are on mute, Steve. You are on mute. Sorry.
Look at that. How embarrassing is that? The second year into a pandemic and I can't find the mute button. Really comprehensive input there, Pietro. Thank you. Margit, just bringing you into that discussion, the teams around this virtual room will be busy thinking about their 2022 plans right now, as much as they will remain agile. Any views from yourself as to the extent to which you'd be expecting climate risk being part of that planning cycle now, as along with all the other risks that the third line supervisors?
So thank you. What I'm thinking about is the risk appetite framework. And what I very often see is the banks cannot cover all their material risks in the risk appetite framework appropriately. I'm thinking here especially of non-financial risks, but also of climate risk, which is, as Petru mentioned, part of traditional risks, but it can be partly also seen as a standalone risk. The bank has to decide which risks are material. Many banks have acknowledged that climate risk is a material risk, but then they have to also take the next step and have to see how they include this risk in their risk appetite framework. Here we often see the traditional risks, market risk in all subcategories, credit risk, but also climate risk has to be then included as standalone, in combination, but it should be somehow reflected there, because if it's not included, it's not reported. And how can the management board make informed decision and see also whether this is the risk appetite framework is implemented? So at the end, it's with the management body to take these decisions based on the risk appetite dashboard. But if the risks are not included, what shall the management body do then? Yeah. And here internal audit comes in, and they also have then to check, is this appropriately included in the risk appetite dashboards?
Yeah, absolutely right. Would you yourself, any perspectives that you're seeing already in terms of the adequate capture of this yet, or is it still, in your eyes, only now emerging and needing a lot more focus to get this risk into the frameworks?
Yes, no, I can see that. As I said, we are in a learning phase, all of us. So yeah. I think that there are, we can see in some part some initial effort, but this effort should continue. I would like to say now that the main problem is linked maybe to the stress test. So I think that it is more the business line that they have to adapt, because the internal audit comes a little bit later, but yeah. We need to be prepared to check if everything goes well. And as also Margit says, risk appetite and possible also the impact on the ICAP, because for the physical risks related to also damages in the buildings, whatever, about the consequence of the climate change, there could be also some impact on capital. I don't think now that we are going to do this, but in perspective, we could expect that some bank could also assess this point in the ICAP framework.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's another good reminder as well, to the point on frameworks being key, that as audit functions, we must always keep in mind that we need to be challenging the frameworks, not always just focusing on how well the existing frameworks are being implemented, which of course is important, but how adequate is the framework itself? Where might it have holes? And I think this climate one is a good example, but we need to keep that in our sights. That's a nice segue maybe on to the next phase of our discussion, exploring the internal...
Sorry, Steve, if I interrupt you, because it's also, we are also aware that not all the regulation is implemented. So also in the definition of what is climate risk, you know, that are discussion at a higher level. So we are also adapting with the discussion with the guideline that the TBA should issue, maybe later next year for sure. So we are saying that internal audit function should be ready to implement this. So start thinking also from now, not delay again. Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's a really good point. Really good point. Thank you, Pietro. And yeah, we mentioned on the last session as well, I don't know if you were listening into that one, that sometimes future dates can seem a long way off, but time goes quickly. You need to be prepared. So you're absolutely right. Now's the time to be getting this into our consciousness. Okay, just moving on to our next focus area in terms of the internal audit process. And we've mentioned already in the discussion the need for internal audit teams to be increasingly agile, very risk prioritized as new things emerge that we need to shift to, and to make sure we've got the right skills. Margit, you had some great points on making sure we have the right skills and capabilities to face into the challenges. So we must change and evolve our processes. And I want to ask the audience a question on this to stimulate a discussion. So with that in mind, how should we be measuring internal audit effectiveness? So we've got up here on the screen a number of possible measures, data points that internal audit teams could be using to measure how are we doing, how effective are we as a function. I'd like you to vote the 3 best measures to measure your internal audit team effectiveness. And again, we've got a mixture in here as the scores start to roll in of what you might consider to be more traditional, old school measures, such as the headcount level, the number of audits delivered, etc. And then the more softer measures, the stakeholder feedback from the board, from the executive, from the staff. So it'd be interesting to see where this comes out. Margit, people have definitely heard your points on the headcount, I think, and staffing level performing well, which is good to see. I think for next year we'll work on some interesting background music to play as the bars move. Okay, so interesting. Shifting around quite a lot here. 25 and 26. Let's just give it a moment because I'm just seeing that the order is jumping quite a lot as we move. Okay, so stakeholder feedback is starting to move towards the top. Oh, an interesting influence to organizational risk and control outcomes. That's something that Evelyn was talking about in her presentation as well, coupled with this need to be moving fast and agile, keeping an eye on the outcome rather than just robotically following process. Interesting. I find it really fascinating, actually, that what we've seen to be coalescing on is towards the top now, we've got some of the softer, more judgmental measures starting to emerge as the leading contenders for effectiveness now. So feedback from various stakeholders and how the internal audit function is influencing positive risk and control outcomes. Interesting, yeah. I certainly recognise this as an initial reaction before I come to yourselves, Margit and Pietro, just to get your reflections on this. It's something that I would be open with, that I am wrestling with right now as a Group Chief Internal Auditor. How can I evolve how I measure my function's effectiveness? And I don't feel we always do a good job of that as a profession, because we often do lean on still the traditional, how many audits have I delivered, how many issues have I raised, how many issues have I closed? And they're important, but we all know that a good operating internal audit function will be positively influencing in a variety of ways. And I don't think we do a good job necessarily of measuring that and capturing it. So those softer things I'm certainly wrestling with. Maybe Margit, to come to you first, just a quick reaction to what you saw on the screen there. Are you surprised by any of those results?
I think that's an excellent result, and I'm very happy that the stakeholders' needs were on top. So were the board's expectations, the audit committee's expectations fulfilled? Because this is at the end what's really important. Pietro mentioned at the beginning, internal audit function has to support the management body. And this is really crucial. And so is the outcome of the service provided, the audit reports, can they be really understood by the board? Are they helpful for the board? So this is really important. So I'm really happy about this outcome, and not about these traditional discussions on how many headcount do you need. because sheer numbers, they completely forget the qualitative dimension.
Yes, yeah, I absolutely agree. Pietro, for yourself, was anything in there a surprise to you?
No, not surprising, but I'm very also happy for the second point, impact on the risk. I don't remember exactly.
Risk outcomes.
Yes, because okay, we have to make clear that in the supervisory approach there is this first, second, and third line. So we do not expect that the internal audit is doing what the second line, the risk management, can do. But indirectly, they can, in a sense, influence with the results of the risk management to do a better work. Also, because otherwise, we would like to avoid that every function will do the same thing. There are, in these three lines of defense, I think a clear, at least ideally clear separation of role and responsibility for the three lines. So we expect this. So very, very happy also that the colleagues have highlighted the right things for us.
Yeah, and maybe just to explore that a little bit further, in terms of, we've got to capture there from the delegates as to the things, the factors on their minds in assessing how they're doing. Are there any particular specific data points, Pietro, or factors that you would point us to as internal auditors to say, yeah, but these are important to how we consider effectiveness of internal audit?
Many thanks, Steve. I would like just to start and repeat what Margit says. For us, it's more important the quality of the activity rather than the number of staff. The staff should be proportionate to the things that the internal audit needs to do. We also think about a collective knowledge. So in a sense that the internal audit could have all the knowledge necessary to assess the internal control framework of the bank that is linked to the business model. So for us, it's the quality and also the frequency of the interaction with the board, and when established the audit committee, a very important thing. Also because when we start the inspections, we usually take on board and read the internal audit reports, even if maybe the internal audit is not within the scope of the inspection, because we also get very valuable information from that. So indirectly, maybe the poor internal auditors are assessed every time, maybe when we conduct an inspection, but this not be, we also appreciate when they anticipate some issues that are in the bank, and this is for us a very important point. Of course, the resources that need to be adequate, as we have already said, in terms of not only quantitative part, but also qualitative. Because sometimes in the past, we see that the focus on the quantitative part maybe was more relevant, but with very lot of improvement on the qualitative part. So we are for sure in the second point. Then of course is the constructive challenge of the first and second line of defense, the business. So these are the usual role. Just to give an example, also we see that after the pandemic, some activities could be done on to check the adequacy of the provision, because now you see that there are many banks that are maybe cancelled the devaluation of the loans, and maybe we don't know if this is because they have to make more good results, or maybe there is effectiveness, an effective improvement. Then there are also sometimes the correct application of the rule, like for example the forbearance, the follow-up of the CEO letter, just to give an example. So the other points that we have also taken into account is the updated of the audit universe and audit plan, as Margit said before. Also, it's important the training plan. We would appreciate if banks could have auditors with certification. Like, for example, the IT, it's important, but not only IT, financial advisor, that are, so this updated knowledge is important, as well as also hiring people from external. We know that it takes more time, but this is important. Then, of course, the methodology update, and what we would also like to appreciate is, especially in this situation when there are a big project underway within the bank, that the internal audit, in a sense, is close to also this big project. Otherwise, it's very difficult at the end to restart completely the process from the scratch. These are maybe the main points that we would like to highlight here.
Yeah,
of course, this means that there should be the independence of the third line should be preserved. Yeah, we are also doing the same at the DCP when discussed with the GST, because we are supposed to be independent.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's really, really useful. And I'm sure the delegates will find that really useful input in terms of the various factors that you would consider to be important. And I really like the breadth across there, so resources, quantitative, yes, but qualitative. The universe, the training plan. So again, it's not just about having a big team. Have you got the right team with the right skills? And back to your quality point, I think that's really rich. Margit, I made a comment earlier that I didn't necessarily feel personally, and it was a personal view, that audit teams were yet telling the best story for themselves or measuring the right things themselves, to cover maybe some of the breadth that Pietro saw just went through there. How would you see that? Do you think audit functions are assessing themselves adequately at the moment?
Let me answer from the perspective of an on-site inspector. What do I see, or what am I concerned about, and where I don't see the necessary effectiveness? So first of all, how is the communication between the audit committee, the management body, and the head of the internal audit function? Can the head of the internal audit function always approach the audit committee when necessary, when they are important and urgent to be rectified findings? Does he or she really have access, immediate access if necessary, to the audit committee, or is there a kind of standard process every quarter, for example?
Yeah.
The next thing I'm thinking about, what is the quality of the internal audit reports? Are they clear? Are they to the point? Or do they use vague concepts to hide something, so that the addressee of the audit report has to read between the lines and several interpretations are possible? The latter is obviously not very effective. Then the third thing I would like to highlight here is the quality of the follow-up process, especially for severe findings. Are there clear deadlines? Is the internal audit function pushing business units and other units inspected to come up here with remediation efforts? Or are they simply waiting? Are they really proactive? Are they pushing? So that's the question here.
That's a very compelling, particularly that last point. I think is really interesting to hear. That proactivity is absolutely essential to be effective. It's not just a simple matter of, well, an audit team has published a finding with a date, so it's up to management, right? I think it's demonstrating that we are agitating and making sure this is being prioritized. And the quality of reports, again, I think would be a very familiar topic for delegates. I think you're right. There's always a challenge to make sure that our messaging is clear. We're not using those lovely long sentences with words that you just think, what does that mean again? Just say it as it is. I think, that is so important. Brilliant. Thank you, guys. That was a really compelling insight into what we should all be thinking about as we tackle a tough future of getting across a number of things. There's just one area that I'd really appreciate your perspectives on and your roles in terms of the collaboration that you're seeing between audit teams and other key stakeholders. So maybe Pietro, starting with how you see the interaction, the quality of interaction between audit functions and ECB teams and inspection teams. How would you appraise that from your observations?
Many thanks, Steve. Okay, it's not an easy answer, I would like to say, but we can say that we see some effort and some improvements, of course, but as supervisor, we want always to have more. We are aware that the internal audit is point of contact during the inspection. They maybe are asked by some team to perform some activities, and we really appreciate it. But for us, the most important thing is that they prepare, in a sense, the bank to the inspection. In a sense, doing their activities, they already identify the risk, because we are very happy when we inspect the bank that we found that the main risks are already highlighted by the bank themselves. This is very plus for us. And so, as I said, as I mentioned also before, we are using the internal audit report in each and every inspections, and this could give us also to the inspector a lot of insights about the problem. Also, a frank and open discussion with the internal audit it's very relevant, not only for the team, but also for the JST. I would like to, I spent also my previous life in the ECB, even if it's a very short life. Before the pandemic, I was in the JST, and I have to say that the dialogue with the internal audit is also, and the JST is also a plus, because you identify what are the issues. Also from the non-financial risk, because everything that is quantitative you can easily read from the number, but the qualitative part, the good report give a very value added for us.
I think that's again a really important point, and it's good to hear that you would always welcome, from your perspective, just more dialogue. I mean, would I be right in assuming that we're, as a profession of internal auditors, we've got some way before we would be annoying ECB teams and JST teams with too much contact? there's still more that would always be welcomed. Excellent. Margot, I'd like to get your perspective, if I can, on another area of collaboration, coordination, which is very important, I think, for audit functions to be effective, and that's with other lines of defence. So the first and second line, and particularly the second line. We've already touched on the importance of retaining clarity in the lines of defence, which I think is absolutely right. Interested to get your views on the level of cooperation and coordination you are seeing between second and third line, and is it where it needs to be, or is this an area we need to focus more on?
Thank you. This is really an important topic, and let me first refer also to the EBA guideline on internal governance, which is really clear here, and Pietro has already highlighted this. The internal audit function has to be independent. And why does it have to be independent? It should come up with conclusions that are not biased. If the internal audit function is involved in setting up processes, procedures, policies, in setting up and validation of new risk models, then the internal audit function is biased and cannot independently review what it has done before. So nevertheless, the internal audit function can provide independent comments. It can be asked by the management body to do so, and also come up with some guidance, and in this way support and clarify things, and also come with their experience and help this way the second or the first line of defense. But they should not do the job of the first or the second line of defense.
I think you're absolutely right. And that last point you were just making there, Margit, resonates with me particularly. Independence is our North Star as a profession, right? We always have to be. And if you don't have that, it's all bets are off anyway. So we must be independent. But I agree with you. I don't think that means not contributing independent insights as we go. We don't have to wait for the car to have crashed to then come in independently and say, oh, the car crashed. We can give input to management and second line live, but it must always be independent and not preclude us from being able to perform any further detailed reviews going forward.
This is really an important aspect that you have mentioned. Internal audit does not have to wait till everything is implemented. It can also provide guidance during the implementation process, but they should not be responsible for the implementation process.
Absolutely right, yeah. We've got enough on anyway as auditors. We don't need to get involved in trying to, do it as well as assure it. Wonderful. Well, listen, we've covered a lot of topics there. I'm sure we might have some questions from the floor. So I might start moving towards seeing what questions we've got. If I pull up the chat. So if you do have questions, either load it into the Slido, and we'll also get it through on the chat function. So there we go. Look, already straight in there with a number of interesting topics. So I'll just take them as they come. Appreciate your perspectives on audit outsourcing models, acceptable levels, best practices, intra-group or external. Also view if within the EU, and that immediately jumped away down to number EU or outside. So I think that the person is looking for some insights into what would be a good outsourcing model. Is it internal from elsewhere in the organisation? Is it external? Let me just give a quick view as a chief internal auditor, and then maybe might welcome any comments from yourselves, Pietro and Margit. So I think we've talked in the discussion already about flexibility, adaptability. So what I think is key for me is that actually we have a range of different potential sources of skill, be that internal or external. I tend towards the external just because of that independence point. I think it's important to preserve that, and the easiest way that I find to do that is to identify external independent providers of skill. Yes, they can be Big Four consultancies, but they don't have to be. There are specialist providers for certain areas. So financial crime, for example, is one where I use a particular boutique firm because I know they're full of former practitioners of financial crime expertise, and that's the type of skill I want in. So for me, my answer to this would be there's no one size fits all. I'd like to see that functions have the ability to do this, but that there's flexibility in where they go. Pietro, I might welcome your any reactions to this question yourself.
Okay, I will start just to say that the outsourcing of some function of the internal audit should be linked also on the materiality of the risk and the skills that are inside the team. So we can allow for a limited period of time if there are if the risk is material and you have to build the competence inside. But for the main risks, I don't think that we can go for a very to push a little bit for the outsourcing of the function. This is also especially because one point that is tricky point I think in this days also mentioned by Margit before is also a lot of banks are moving on the cloud. This means that is an outsourcing, and you can rely on internal audit function of Google, Amazon, whatsoever. But this does not mean that the internal audit could and should have the possibility also to revise this, because what is also my personal view is that these companies are very good. I don't want to say, but this also increases a little bit the would like to say financial systemic risk. Because imagine that there are a lot of outsourcing on Google, and Google for whatever it stops. We cannot imagine. This do not affect one bank as in the past, but maybe Europe or America in one single minute. So also to revise and challenge this outsourcer is a very important point.
Yeah,
I stop here.
Thank you, Pietro. Margaret, you spoke very clearly about the skills aspect here, and I think the asker of this question is really interested in complementing audit skills. Any particular perspectives you'd have in terms of when audit teams look to outsource to get their skill, and what would be good or not good?
I think a lot of banks rely on in-house outsourcing. And I think here the pitfall is that sometimes, because it's in-house outsourcing, or intra-group outsourcing, I should say, sometimes one blindly relies on the intra-group service provider just because it's intra-group, and there are even no clear criteria to assess the quality of outsourcing service provided within a group of banks. So here one should not blindly rely here on the quality of results. One should also have criteria to check this.
Yeah.
And a clear common understanding what is the minimum quality expected, even if this is an intra-group outsourcing.
Completely agree. Yeah, very good. All right, let's move on from that question. The topic of risk culture caught people's attention, it looks like. So we've got a question here. How do you measure constructive challenge, impact and influence on the risk culture? I'm guessing from audit teams. What data points would you consider in order to assess the audit team's impact on risk culture, quantitative, qualitative, etc.? So, Pietro, I think you made the point really
yes,
well.
Yes.
So, any perspectives on how you would assess the audit team's impact on risk culture?
Yes. No, I would like to stress this. 3 points would I like to say. The first is the impact on the incentives that people has. So remuneration, it's important that this would be performed well, because this creates misbehavior. The second thing is the misbehavior, fraud, and whatsoever, how to prevent it, also using the technology, I would like to say, for something. And of course, the last part that is not 100% on our remits is the AML. You know that anti-money laundering, to prevent the money laundering, is one thing that we indirectly also we see in the inspection, for example, compliance whatsoever. So we do not have the responsibility that will be hand over, but we have some responsibility also on that. So these are I think the 3 main areas that we will try to assess when we see the risk culture.
Yeah. So you'd expect audit teams to have plenty of good coverage on these areas in order to demonstrate their role, Pietro, incentives, fraud, AML. Margit, would you have any thoughts on what we should look at to demonstrate that audit teams are impacting the risk culture in a positive way?
I think when internal audit teams are assessing a topic, they could also, on top of what Pietro already mentioned, always check whether concerns were also taken on board, whether people can freely speak up within the bank when they are involved in a topic, or whether there is one person simply deciding on everything, and at the end, concerns were completely ignored, were maybe not even documented.
Yeah, it's voice in the room, isn't it? Balance of the voice in the room, psychological safety that we're observing for people to challenge, all those types of perspectives, perhaps. Yeah.
These are the right thing that you have just said. That it is important also to have established whistleblower procedures internally to the banks. It's really important, and internal audit could have a role also in this part.
So sometimes also we check during on-site inspections what comments came up in the whistleblowing process, especially when we have an indication from a risk-oriented perspective to do so. And we would also recommend to the internal audit function to do so once in a while. Also look in an anonymized way for sure on what has been raised here in the whistleblowing process. Yeah,
absolutely. I think there was a linked question in there about would we be expecting systematic audits of culture? I might just offer a perspective myself on that, and then open up for yourselves if you think differently or any additional points. I've seen that in the past. In one of my prior teams, we will have conducted some audits that were focused on the topic of culture. Predominantly, when we did that, it was seeking to provide assurance that the first and second line had approaches to establishing a target culture and then assessing it. So it was mostly a review of the approach being taken. I think they can be helpful, but as one-off discrete pieces, they're not always the best tool. I think there's ways in which audit functions can more routinely, through all of their interactions, all of their work, just have this cultural question at the front of mind and be able to draw out the relevant points. So I'd favour that kind of second approach. Pietro, it looks like that would be something you'd agree with.
No. I think that this is an approach that could value. The idea is that the risk culture, as I said, is that maybe the first line of the real first line of defense in a bank. Yeah. Because if the approach of everyone is oriented to look at the risk, the possible consequence on the reputational risk of the bank, this could help the bank to react in a better way, even in a very bad situation. And we also seen that the banks that are more resilient, they have a very good risk culture.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, let's bring the questions back up again and see what other topics have we got. Cloud. Let's see if we've covered this one potentially, because you mentioned cloud already. Banks move more and more to external cloud for critical outsourcing. How do you see the responsibility of internal audit towards the big techs? So maybe leveraging that point you made, Pietro, about the fact that we are seeing people coalesce onto big providers. Margit, I might get your perspectives on this topic. So what expectations would you have on internal audit teams for them turning their attention towards those cloud providers and getting assurance on the cloud provider as well as their internal bank?
Definitely, also this has to be covered, as Pietro has mentioned. All areas that can cause any risk should be covered by internal audit. So very simple answer. Yeah.
So absolutely, needs to be in there. I think as it's been for a while with any key outsourcing relationship, this one just happens to be a digital outsource provider and a very important one increasingly. But yes, we do need to demonstrate how we're providing assurance over that.
Also, because I think that is, sorry if I interrupt, Steve, there is also an item in the contract that should be according also to the EBA guideline that the internal audit could access to the external provider. And for us, there is no difference between an external provider, for example, in Italy, or the big tech. For us, maybe the difference is that the big tech have more market power, but there should be also a way to see if there are risks that are taken, because the outsourcing, you know better than me, in the past started with a good thing, because you outsource the process to the responsibility to another, but in the end you will retain maybe the tail of the risk. This is the problem of the outsourcing. But
yeah, I agree. That's the classic outsource the process, not the risk, isn't it? I think there is a connection to the previous point we were discussing on skills again, because when you're looking at provision of assurance on cloud, this is back to, well, we need to make sure we have the skills in the team, or we are buying in the skills from providers into audit teams to be able to ask the right questions to get these answers when we go in to cloud providers. So capability again is a theme coming out here. Okay.
Yes, Steve, also because if I made the last point, it's also a matter of business continuity in this case.
Yeah.
So, and the internal audit cannot avoid the responsibility also to have a look on the business continuity of the bank, because there are exercises that are performed by dedicated teams internal to the bank, but I think the internal audit could also review if everything works well. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely right. Let me just check if we have any more questions. I'm not sure if there's any more. No further questions at the moment. So look, I might just seek to wrap it up. I think we've had a very wide-ranging and very rich conversation. I've certainly, just as I reflect on the things we've talked about, there's a few things that stand out to me as key takeaways and themes. Quality and qualitative is a topic, that we've touched on a number of times. So when we're thinking about internal audit, lessons learned from the past, important approaches we're going to bring to the future, it's not just about the mechanics, the process, the amount of people you have in the department. It's quality of the skills, quality of the audit reports, the clarity of the messages. And similarly, if you then apply that lens to the subject matter of what we do, it's not just assuring that a process has been followed, it's what's underneath the bonnet, the quality of what's been done, the risk numbers that, Margaret, you spoke about in your presentation. So I think that quality takeaway, agility has come up again and again through the discussion. So absolutely what I've heard is, as audit teams, guys, we need to be agile, we need to be moving when the world is shifting, when our organizations are shifting and something happens, like a cyber event or a fraud that was referred to before. We need to demonstrate how we've moved appropriately and risk prioritized at all time, not just follow the plan as we laid down 6 or 12 months ago. I think proactivity is another theme that I heard throughout a lot of the discussion. So again, on that agility, it's there, but also if we're raising findings, let's not just then wait to be told by the business or first or second line. Let's get in there. Let's be pushing and being proactive. And same point on the emerging risk types, right? So on climate, let's be proactive in asking the questions now as to how our first, second line looking to incorporate this into frameworks, etc. And the last one that just maybe covers all of that is the big agenda, guys. There's a lot of breadth out there. There's a lot of topics. So I think it's for us going to be ruthless prioritization and ability to explain how we've deployed our skills and resources where we have and why that's the right approach. So Pietro, Margaret, I'd like to hugely thank you for your insights and your generosity of your openness in the discussion and the Q&A. It's been incredibly useful for all the delegates. So huge thanks both, and look forward to welcoming you back maybe at the next one.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right.
Many thanks. I hope that we added a little bit of value also for the discussion, I would like to say. This is our ambition.
I would say absolutely you did both. So very much appreciated. Thank you. Speak to you soon.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.